You felt it just now, didn't you? That split-second hesitation before you speak. That internal scan. Will they like this version of me? And just like that, you edit yourself. Not because it's true, not because it's right, but because it's safer. Here's the part no one says out loud. You are not being nice. You are negotiating your existence, and it's costing you more than you think. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to see why the compulsion to be liked isn't harmless. It's one of the most precise forms of self-sabotage you've been practicing. Quietly, repeatedly, almost perfectly. Think about your last conversation. Not what you said, what you didn't say. That opinion you softened, that boundary you diluted, that truth you swallowed because it might create friction. You felt it rise up, clear and sharp, and then you blurred it. Why? Because somewhere along the way, you learned this rule. Discomfort equals danger. So you adapted. You became agreeable, easy, palatable. And at first, it worked. People smiled. They approved. They stayed. But here's the twist that slowly unfolds over time. They didn't stay for you. They stayed for the version of you that requires the least resistance. And now, you're trapped maintaining it. Watch how subtle this gets. You say yes when you mean maybe, you say maybe when you mean no, and eventually, you stop knowing what you mean at all. Because your internal compass has been outsourced, replaced by something far more unstable, other people's reactions, their tone, their mood, their approval. You read faces like survival signals. You anticipate disappointment before it even exists. And without realizing it, you start living defensively. Not boldly, not honestly, defensively. Here's where it gets dangerous. You think you're building connection, but what you're actually building is dependency. Because if your sense of self is shaped by how well you're received, then rejection doesn't just sting, it destabilizes you. So you avoid it at all costs. You over-explain, over-apologize, over-deliver. Not from generosity, but from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being disliked, fear of being ordinary. Or worse, dismissed. Let's go deeper. This isn't just behavior, it's a mechanism. A quiet protector that formed early, when approval meant safety, when being liked meant belonging, when being too much or too difficult had consequences. So you adapted. You became what people needed you to be, and it worked. Back then. But now, it's outdated software running your entire life, and it's glitching in ways you can feel but haven't fully named. That exhaustion you carry after social interactions, not from talking, from performing, from constantly calculating. Did that land? Did I say too much? Do they still like me? It's mental overdrive disguised as social awareness, and it drains you. Because authenticity requires energy, but inauthenticity, that requires constant maintenance. And here's the part that stings. The more you shape yourself to be liked, the less visible you actually become. Because people can only connect with what you reveal. And if what you reveal is filtered, curated, diluted, then connection becomes shallow, predictable, replaceable. Now pause for a second, because this is where the illusion breaks. You're not afraid of being disliked. You're afraid of what being disliked means, that you're not enough, not valuable, not worthy of staying. So you manage perception like it's survival, and in doing that, you abandon the one thing that would actually ground you, your internal integrity. Let me flip this for you. What if the discomfort you're avoiding is actually the signal that you're being real? What if friction isn't failure, but evidence of presence? Because when you stop smoothing every edge, something interesting happens. You become harder to digest, but impossible to ignore. And yes, some people will pull away, but not because you failed, because you stopped performing, and they were only ever connected to the performance. So the real question isn't, how do I get people to like me? It's, what am I sacrificing to be liked? And is it worth it? Because if every interaction requires you to shrink, soften, or silence yourself, then you're not building relationships. You're maintaining illusions. And illusions always come with a cost. You just haven't fully calculated it yet. But we will. Because in the next part, you're going to see exactly how this pattern doesn't just affect your relationships, it quietly rewires your ambition, your confidence, and your entire trajectory. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it.
Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because this isn't just about social interactions anymore. This pattern, it leaks into everything. Your work, your goals, your decisions. Even the ones you tell yourself are personal. You think you're choosing your path, but look closer. How many of your choices are actually responses? Responses to expectations, to timelines, to what looks acceptable. You don't just want to succeed, you want your success to be approved, recognized, validated. And that changes everything. Because now you're not chasing what matters, you're chasing what looks right. And those are not the same thing. Let me show you how precise this sabotage is. You hesitate to start something meaningful, not because you lack ability, but because you can't control how it will be received. So you delay, you research, you prepare, you wait until it's perfect enough to be liked. But perfection isn't your goal. Approval is. And approval has a moving target, so you stay stuck, polishing something that never gets released, holding back ideas that never get tested, silencing instincts that never get sharpened, all because somewhere in your mind, rejection equals exposure, and exposure feels like risk. This is where imposter syndrome quietly feeds, not because you're incapable, but because you've trained yourself to rely on external confirmation. So without it, you feel like a fraud, even when you're not, especially when you're not. Now zoom out. Look at the long-term cost. Every time you defer to what others might think, you weaken your ability to decide for yourself. Your standards blur, your voice softens, your direction fragments, until one day you're successful by someone else's definition and completely disconnected from your own. And that's the real loss, not failure, misalignment. You start feeling it as subtle resentment toward people who didn't ask you to shrink but benefited from it, toward opportunities you accepted but never truly wanted, toward yourself for knowing better and still choosing comfort. And here's the paradox. The more you try to be seen as good, the harder it becomes to actually feel good, because good becomes performative, conditional, dependent. You do things not because they're right, but because they'll be perceived as right. You give but expect silent recognition. You help but feel unseen when it's not acknowledged. You're not just acting, you're keeping score. And that quiet scorekeeping, that's where resentment grows, slowly, quietly, until it shows up in ways you don't immediately recognize. Short patience, hidden frustration, emotional fatigue that doesn't quite make sense. Because deep down, you know something isn't aligned. You just haven't confronted it directly. So let's do that now. The compulsion to be liked isn't about kindness, it's about control. Control over how you're perceived,
control over how you're treated, control over whether you're accepted. But here's the truth. You cannot control perception without distorting reality, and the reality you're distorting is your own. So what does it look like to step out of this? Not dramatically, not all at once, but deliberately. It starts small. You let a moment of silence exist without filling it. You say no without cushioning it in 5 layers of apology. You express an opinion and let it stand, unedited. And yes, it feels unfamiliar, because you're no longer buffering reality. You're meeting it directly. Some people will adjust, some won't. But the ones who stay, they're no longer responding to a projection. They're responding to you. And something else happens too. Your energy returns, because you're no longer splitting yourself into acceptable fragments. You're integrated, clear, decisive. That clarity, it compounds in your work, in your relationships, in your self-trust. Because every time you choose authenticity over approval, you send yourself a message. I can handle being seen, not perfectly, not universally liked, but honestly. And that's where real confidence comes from, not from being validated, but from being aligned. So the next time you feel that familiar pull to soften, to adjust, to perform, pause, not to calculate, but to check in. What is true here? And more importantly, am I about to betray that truth just to be liked? Because every time you choose approval over authenticity, you reinforce a version of yourself that needs permission to exist. And every time you don't, you take that permission back. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And that's the shift. From being liked to being real. From being accepted to being self-directed. From being safe to being free. And freedom, it's not comfortable at first, but it's honest. And that honesty is what makes everything else finally start to work. If this hits something real for you, don't just move on. Subscribe, like the video, because most people won't confront this pattern, and that's exactly why it keeps running their lives in the background. But you've seen it now, and once you see it, you get to decide differently.